Transition now, ladies and gentlemen, to a discussion on perhaps the most vital global challenge, and that's climate change. Alok Sharma, who's president of COP26, is going to appear on this screen, I hope, in just a minute with Al Roker of NBC News. There's Alok Sharma. Very nice to see you from a long distance. And you've got the right imagery behind you. Al Roker, welcome. I'm Nick Burns, Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group. I want to welcome all of you in the United States and Europe and beyond at this late hour, I know, in the United Kingdom. Alok Sharma is president of COP26. He was appointed full-time as president of COP26 in January of 2021. He's a very experienced leader in the British government. He's been Secretary of State for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. He was previously Secretary of State for International Development from 2019 to 20, and Minister of State for Employment at the Department of Work and Pensions, and Minister of State for Housing and Planning. And obviously, someone who's going to try to put together 195 nation states in common cause needs to have this type of high-level governmental experience, which Alok Sharma certainly has. He's going to be interviewed by someone well-known to every American participating, and that's Al Roker of NBC News, who's the weather and feature anchor at the Today Show, co-host of the third hour of Today, and someone who's been a big part of American broadcasting and journalism for many decades. We welcome Al. I would just say to both of you, this is the second day of our Aspen Security Forum. We've covered issues from Afghanistan to the Middle East. We've had a big focus on China. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School, and our students from all over the world, their greatest passion is that the world will tackle climate change and avert a global catastrophe. And I just feel that energy from students from China, from Brazil, from the United Kingdom, and from the United States. From a political perspective, I would just say, Alok and Al, it's the dominant global issue of our time. U.S.-China relations is very competitive and very important. But doing something about climate change, arresting carbon emissions, averting a global catastrophe is of the highest priority. So I guess the questions I would have as I hand this off to Al Roker, what are realistic goals for COP26 in Glasgow? And you'll have the American president there, the Chinese president, all the world leaders, the British prime minister. And I think you'll see in the Biden administration, the American administration that has done more to highlight this issue, and I've been involved in U.S. diplomacy for off and on for 41 years, in the appointments of John Kerry and Gina McCarthy, and in the priority that President Biden has given, I think you're going to deal with an American administration that's taking this more seriously than any prior administration. So I just, as a way of comments, I've been very excited about this panel. And Al, thank you for being our anchor. And Alok, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alok. Nice to meet you. And so I was wondering, as we go into this, and you're looking at looking ahead to COP26, when we talk about these issues, which sectors, when we look globally, have to be involved to ensure we don't reach that 1.5 degree or worse, a tipping point when you look at this from a global perspective?
Well, Al, thank you so much for being part of this event with me. I'm delighted to be here and to be invited by the Aspen Institute to take part. I'm actually currently sitting in Brasilia. I've been traveling around the world, obviously talking to governments, and just had a set of constructive dialogues here with government ministers. But if I say to you that the overarching ambition that I have for COP26 is that we emerge from Glasgow with us being able to credibly say that we have kept 1.5 alive. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in Paris in 2015, world leaders agreed as part of the Paris Agreement that they would do everything they could to keep global temperature rises well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5, and that's what we want to achieve in Glasgow. And as part of that, I'm having a consistent message that I'm delivering to governments around the world. Firstly, they need to set out ambitious plans to cut emissions in the near term by 2030, but then also to make commitments to go to net zero by the middle of the century. Secondly, to adapt to the climate change that is already happening around us. We see that in all our countries. Climate change doesn't respect borders, and we're going to have to respond to what we already have and that we're facing. Thirdly, the really important issue of finance. To be able to deliver a lot of these changes, a lot of the climate resilient infrastructure that we want to see, particularly in developing countries, developed nations have to step up and they have to deliver on this $100 billion a year dollars figure that was first actually mooted in 2009 and then again in 2015. This is the time. We now have to show developing countries that we're going to step up to that. And finally, of course, there are a range of issues that are still outstanding in terms of detailed rules from the Paris Agreement that we need to make sure we reach agreement on. So, what I would say, Al, is that, of course, governments need to act. But I do think we are at this interesting inflection point where just about every country I visit, businesses, civil society, and government are singing from the same hymn sheet, recognizing that we need to take climate action together. And I've been really encouraged by what I've been seeing around the world.
Well, we hear a lot about a federal government or any country's government taking part in this. But for example, in this country, over the last 4 years, it's no secret that there were a number of rollbacks of environmental issues, environmental regulations, yet local, state, town governments kind of stepped up to say, well, no, we're going to still keep up with these emission standards, for these environmental standards. Is that really, in a sense, the future? That yes, it's one thing for these global governments to take care of this or to try to, but that local governments, state and local governments are saying, we're not going to wait for our federal counterparts. We are going to take the bull by the horns and move forward.
Look, I think it's really important that federal governments take action. Ultimately, they are the parties to the UNFCCC. They're the ones who are going to have to make the commitments, those nationally determined contributions to those commitments to go to net zero by the middle of the century. But of course, exactly as you said, even under the last US administration, you saw states, both Democrat and Republican, coming forward with a positive agenda on climate action. And look, I have to say, I'm really pleased that we now have an administration in the US that is putting tackling climate change front and center of both domestic policy, but also in terms of their international efforts. And that aligns really well with what we are doing in the UK as well. And I think it's particularly heartening that one of the first acts that President Biden took when he came into office was to sign that executive order on rejoining the Paris Agreement. I can't tell you how much of an impact that has made around the world. And it says very clearly the US is back on the front line of the fight against climate change. But you're right. I said to you, I'm in Brazil at the moment. I had a really good discussion this morning with governors responsible for states, with mayors responsible for some of the major cities, with businesses, and they're all signing up to the Race to Zero campaign, which is committing them to go to net zero by 2050. And for me, I think that's a very positive action where we're seeing not just at a federal level, but actually also at a local and regional level, this real ambition coming forward.
Looking globally, we just last month's G20 meeting, there wasn't even an agreement on a date to phase out coal or limit climate change to that 1.5 degrees. So where do we go from that point?
Well, Al, I was there at that meeting in Naples, and let's look at the positives that came out of that. The first thing is that we had all G20 countries agreeing that they would come forward with ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets before COP26 in November. That was positive. We had governments coming forward in that communique saying that they were going to be focusing on the long-term strategies that also need to be delivered so that we can see what their actual plans are. And I think there was an acknowledgement in the communique that this next decade is going to be absolutely decisive. That was the positive part of it, but I agree with you. I said after that meeting, I was disappointed that we weren't able to reach agreement on the phase out of unabated coal, that we weren't able to reach agreement in terms of international financing for coal projects around the world. But let's look at what we agreed at the G7 just a few weeks earlier. All countries in the G7 are now committed to go to net zero by 2050. They've set out ambitious targets to cut emissions by 2030, and they have also set out very clearly the ending of international coal financing, as indeed has South Korea. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful, but certainly when it comes to the G20, I want to make sure that we have that as a big issue in terms of phase out of coal, unabated coal, and that of course now moves forward to the G20 leaders. I've made it very clear that for me, consigning coal power to history has to be one of the things that we try and achieve on the road to COP26. It's one of those issues that I think is going to be really important and totemic, and that's why we need to make sure that when the G20 leaders meet, that is a commitment that can be made.
And Alok, what about the G20's commitment to help developing countries? I mean, we've had that 2009 UN agreement to contribute 100 billion annually for climate finance for these poorer countries, but that hasn't been met yet. How important is it to make sure that the haves help the have-nots when it comes to global carbon emissions?
It's absolutely vital, and I've said, Al, that this is a matter of trust for developing countries. And climate negotiations, as those who are taking part in this event will know, are fragile. Trust is
Alok, I think we've lost the sound. You might be on mute.
Alok, we can't hear Alok. No.
Is that better?
There you are. You're back.
No.
Yeah, I can hear him.
Am I back?
You are back, sir.
Okay, I can't hear you now for some reason. Technology. This is why we need to have these physical discussions again. Can you? Okay, great. We're back. We're back.
Excellent.
So
yes.
As I was saying, in terms of the 100 billion, what I did was we held a meeting with these 50 ministers, many of them in person in London on the 25th and 26th of July. And one of the outcomes of that is that we agreed.
Uh-oh. I think we lost you again, Alok. We can't.
No. Sorry, NBC.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hearing you, I think I hear you now.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry,
Yes.
it's very intermittent. I'm very sorry. Sorry, I was just explaining that in terms of the agreement that we've reached is that we will set out a delivery plan before COP26 to demonstrate how that 100 billion a year is going to be reached. I think at the G7, straight after the G7, we did have a number of countries, Germany, we had Japan, we had Canada come forward with fresh money. And of course, what I want to see is for all the donor countries to come forward. And I've been very pleased with the announcements that have been made so far from the US. But of course, there are also indications that we've had that there may be more funding coming for climate finance from the US government. And we're looking forward to hearing more details on that in due course.
Speaking of that, Alok, and look, we're all coming out of this pandemic. Obviously, there are setbacks and such. But as we have COVID and in the same time, perhaps like a green recovery, are we missing an opportunity? Are countries missing an opportunity as they look to help their citizens with this pandemic recovery to make sure that there is a climate factor to this to help make sure we recover in a more green sense?
Well, Al, certainly in the conversations that I've had, many governments have recognized that this is that opportunity to build back better, to build back greener, to coin a phrase. And certainly from a UK perspective, that is what we are doing.
I'm sorry, I think we lost you again, Alok.
Sorry, Minister Sharma, we can't hear you.
Hello? Is that any better?
You're kind of back.
Okay, I'm sorry. We're going to try and swap laptops and see whether that makes a difference. So bear with us.
There was a U.S. comedy team called Bob and Ray, and they always had one of their routine was there's a reporter, Wally Ballou, and he'd always start Ballou, and he'd move his lips. Anyway, it kind of reminds me a little of this.
I promise you, Al, that's not what I'm doing.
No, I know, but it would be brilliant if you were. That would have been fantastic.
But just going back to the point about the green recovery, I think that is what governments want to see. I said that's something that we're pursuing in the UK, and that's a message that I'm delivering to countries around the world. You will have seen that actually I think in the last day, we've had the IMF has approved the general allocation of SDR, $650 billion. Now, this is an opportunity for obviously countries to support their own economies, but I think it's also an opportunity for the wealthiest nations to think about potential reallocations and how they can support developing countries as well.
Here in this country, in the United States, there's been a lot of talk about the infrastructure bill, and there's a component. There are components in that, and I don't know how much you've seen of it. Because we haven't seen, obviously, the final bill, but that climate is part of that. Is that kind of a model that other countries are looking at? Have you seen that? Obviously, you mentioned in the UK that's happening, but are you hopeful that that's part of the plan going forward?
I am hopeful, and I think if you look at countries in Europe, for instance, that is certainly something that they're channeling as part of their recovery plans. And indeed, when I go around the world, talking about a transition in terms of energy, a clean energy transition, again, is something that countries are very focused on. So I think there is this desire, but of course, what you need to make sure you do is, as well as supporting a recovery with public funds, I think countries need to think about how do you leverage in private sector money as well. And I think that's going to be vital. We know that there is a wall of money out there. We know that the private sector, particularly the financial services sector, is incredibly keen on ensuring that they're going green. And but what we need to make sure is that governments are also looking at the revenue mechanisms and putting them in place to ensure that the private sector is able to invest in economies around the world.
You bring up the private sector, and I was wondering, how important is it in your role and in COP26 to enlighten those sectors that you can do good and also financially do well by being greener?
I think, Al, the private sector is already there. I think the private sector is already there. They have understood that this is an opportunity in terms of a green recovery, in terms of green growth, that delivers not just cleaner environments, but also delivers economic prosperity. I mean, let me give you an example from the UK. Over the past 30 years, we've managed to grow our economy by almost 80%. And yet we have cut emissions by over 40%. So we have demonstrated, in fact, we're not alone in this. Other countries have done the same. I talked about the Race to Zero campaign, where non-state actors, including businesses, commit to going to net zero by 2050, but on concrete plans, not just some sort of vague assertion that that's what they're going to do. And increasingly, I am seeing businesses sign up to that. We also have, since we talk about the financial services sector, we have a grouping under the Race to Zero called GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Over $80 trillion worth of assets have been committed to that. That is a significant amount of money. What we need to now do is to ensure that that funding is then also being able to be channeled into developing countries so that you can have a clean, resilient infrastructure, but also then obviously deliver a return for the private sector at the same time.
Alok, I don't know about, say, in the UK or other countries in the G20, but here in America, when we talk about clean jobs, but also talking about relieving our reliance on coal, on fossil fuels, people get frightened because that means their jobs, their way of life may be going away. How important is it to say, okay, this may be going away, but we're bringing this in, and hopefully we can transition to this that will improve your quality of life job-wise?
Look, I think this is vitally important. And in fact, this concept of a just transition applies across the world. And Al, you're absolutely right. If you look at the UK, back in 2012, 40% of our electricity was coming from coal. We're now at less than 2%. By 2024, we will have no coal in our electricity mix at all. But of course, what we've been able to do is now grow and have the biggest offshore wind sector in the world. And what we need to be doing is ensuring that we are equipping people with the skills. We have a Green Jobs Task Force. We work with trade unions as well to ensure that we can have people equipped for the jobs of the future. And actually, there are transferable skills as well. I recently went to a geothermal site actually in the UK. And I met people there who previously worked in the oil and gas sector, and they were able to work in geothermal projects because they had very clear transferable skills. And I think that is something that is incumbent on all governments to ensure that at the same time as we are going green, at the same time as we are creating these green jobs, we help people transition to that, because we really do not want anybody left behind as part of this process.
When it comes to COP26, there was a study that still sticks out to me, 2017, the US Department of Defense did, that said, and it's only gotten worse, that climate change is the #1 threat to the US's homeland security. Do you find that for other countries, developed countries? And if so, how important is it to those countries as far as their own homeland defense to make climate change mitigation an important part of their policies?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think climate change is one of those all-encompassing issues that affects, a range of security. So whether it's energy security or indeed border security or indeed food security, I mean, all of this is impacted by what we are seeing in terms of climate change. I talked about the fact that we want to ensure at Glasgow that we have done our bit to be able to say we've kept that 1.5 degree limit within reach. The reality is, the science tells us that we are already at over 1 degree global warming, depending on which report you look at, 1.1, 1.2. We are seeing the impacts of that around the world. I mean, you're experiencing this in the US as well. We're experiencing it in the UK. I have visited communities around the world who are being displaced because of the climate change that is happening now. I was recently in Vietnam, a country growing at a very good rate. But the reality is that if we get to global temperature rises of 2 degrees on average, 40% of the Mekong Delta is going to be under seawater. And that's going to affect the lives of 17 million people, their lives and their livelihoods. And you have to think about what happens. Where do those people go when they're affected by the impacts of climate change. And that's why I think climate change is one of those all-encompassing issues that affects security on so many levels for every country around the world.
Right. Well, I believe we're supposed to leave some time for questions. So
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks, Al. We have a question waiting for us. We have Stanley Shapiro, who is a college sophomore, who has a question for us, please. Stanley. Stanley, you're on mute. Now you're clear.
All right, great. So thank you to both for this incredible discussion on a topic that, as Al says, is incredibly pertinent to the security conference here, as it is a huge national security issue. But I had a question on global cooperation regarding climate change. Obviously, the efforts needed to start combating climate change and saving the planet will be massive, to say the least. And I'm wondering if you think that this cooperation will lead to will be a catalyst for cooperation on other issues in this world, or if you think this will use up political capital, to use the term, of local politicians and governments across the world, and will actually reduce cooperation on other issues and start to actually exacerbate them.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's a great question. The reality is that the UK, the US will have differences of opinions with countries around the world. That's a fact of life. However, on this one issue, when it comes to climate, this is something that impacts us all. And certainly in the discussions that I have had with countries around the world, there is a clear recognition that if we don't collectively tackle climate change, it is going to have an impact on all of us. So I do think climate is an issue where we can work collectively together. Frankly, we need to. It needs every country to put their best foot forward on this. And clearly, if that cooperation leads to cooperation in other areas, of course, I very much welcome it. But for me, in my role as COP26 President Designate, the key issue is that we are collaborating internationally on climate. And certainly the conversations that I'm having around the world suggest that there is a realization that we do need to work as a global community on this issue.
Alok, I was wondering, as you look at this going into COP26, being realistic, what is your optimism level on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being, I am going to hide in a closet, to 10 being, I am thrilled and delighted.
Al, you're sounding like some of the journalists that put these questions to me. Look, let me answer it like this: is that I'm hopeful that countries collectively understand that this next decade is going to be absolutely decisive, and that there is a requirement for us to come together. I said to you in London when I held this ministerial meeting with a very large number of ministers from around the world coming together, there was what I would describe as the spirit of London very prevalent. There was a desire to try and reach agreement on some thorniest issues that have evaded us so far in terms of climate negotiations. Are we there? No. Are we making progress? Yes. And the one thing I have said to absolutely every single government that I've talked to is that, yes, the UK does have the presidency of COP26, which we share with our Italian friends, but success at COP26 is going to belong to us, is going to belong to the whole world. And ultimately, we do this not just for our generation, but future generations as well. And just one thought I have on this, which is that for a child that is born today, it doesn't matter where that child is born, whether it's in the US or in China or South Africa or the UK, for that child that is born today, his or her future, when it comes to the planet, will be determined before that child finishes primary school. And that's because this next decade is going to be absolutely decisive. And that's why we need every country to come forward in a spirit of collaboration and for us to reach a successful outcome at Glasgow. I do think this is our last best chance, and we really cannot fail.
You raise an interesting point in that you talk about a child born today. Are you heartened by and given some sort of good feeling the fact that this generation, I've got a 22-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old son, and to them, this is the greatest threat facing this planet, that they are so vocal, that this same generation that marched arm in arm across the world, really, when it came to racial injustice during this past summer, but also to them, just as important is our climate crisis.
Well, I have two daughters. I have a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old. And I can tell you, they are constantly telling me that I need to work even harder in terms of what we're trying to achieve at COP26. This generation is absolutely right. This is a vital issue. And the decisions that this set of world leaders takes is going to impact on them and their generations. And that's why I'm pleased that they are vocal, that they are standing up, they are putting a mirror to world leaders now and saying that we have to collectively act. 6 months ago to Glasgow, I gave a speech actually at a big wind farm, onshore wind farm that is near Glasgow. And before I gave that speech, I spoke to my daughters and I said, what is the one message you want me to give to world leaders? And they said simply, tell them to pick the planet. And that is a message that is coming through loud and clear from young people around the world. Every visit that I make to an individual country, I speak to civil society, I speak to young people, and they are speaking with one voice. They want us to get this right at COP26, and that's what we all need to collectively do.
And quickly, one last thing. You mentioned different administrations. How do you harden what comes out of COP26 so that when there's a change in an administration, no matter what country, that what has been agreed to continues to stay on track? Yeah,
so I think that this is a sort of an important issue. What I would say to you, look, I'll give you our example from the UK and other countries where I think there is a political consensus on this issue. And I think we are going to see that growing political consensus. This isn't, globally, certainly this isn't about sort of, right and left. This is about what is the right thing to do for our planet. So I hope that global consensus continues. And I hope that what we put in place in Glasgow is something that endures, because frankly, if we don't, then the future we have ahead of us is going to be really very bleak.
Well, Alok, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for putting up with my inept questions. And you're doing a Marcel Marceau at times.
Thank you so much.
Your questions were brilliant. Thank you very much for having me on. I hope when I'm in the States, I can come and do a physical event together with Aspen. Looking forward to that.
We'd welcome that. Thank you so much, Minister Sharma. Thank you, Al Roker. I'm going to pass it back to Ambassador.